All right, I like that. Welcome to Shenandoah Academy. It's good to have you here. You guys happy to be here?
Yeah.
All right. How long of a ride is that? A long ride? I don't know where Shenandoah Academy is. Like 3 hours? 4? More. 8 hours. 9. Man, it keeps going up. Do I have a 10? Can I get a 10? Just wanted to let the teachers know, the drivers know for the way back, right? 11, 12, whatever. Well, thank you guys for making that trip. It's great that you're here.
Amen.
So, my name is John. I'm not the pastor here. I'm a chaplain up at the hospital in the area. And so I'm filling in for the normal pastor. And today we're going to talk about the book of John. The book of John, since my name is John, is near and dear to my heart. And I'm almost always ready to dive in there. Actually, I usually preach from the Revised Common Lectionary because I also speak at some churches in the area, some Sunday churches. And tomorrow we're looking at John chapter 21, the very last chapter in the entire book. And as much as I love the book of John, I get to chapter 21 and I hit the brakes. And so for my whole life, I've been reading the book of John and loving and loving and loving it. And then I get to chapter 21 and I say, what the heck is going on in here? Right? Like, I have no idea what they're talking about and how this fits. And so I'm struggling. And so today I did another dive into the book, into the chapter specifically, in hopes that I could figure out this mystery. And I want you guys, I'm going to just read the first 19 verses. I didn't put it up on the screen for y'all. You can read it on your phone, or you can just listen, hang out for a second, grab the Bible in your pew in front of you. And it's not stories that you're unfamiliar with, but I want you to see what's the mystery in here. What does not make sense as we read this, okay? So maybe at the end of this, I'm going to ask you guys, what does not make sense about this passage? All right, ready? Here we go. So John chapter 21, starting with verse 1. There was one other time when Jesus appeared to the disciples, this time by the Sea of Tiberias. This is how it happened. Simon Peter, Thomas the twin, Nathanael the Galilean from Cana, and the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. So they're just there hanging out. When Simon Peter says, I'm going fishing. The other disciples that were there said, hey, we'll come along with you. So they went out into a boat and caught nothing through the night. So they fished all night, they caught nothing. Zero zilch. And as day, verse 4, as day was breaking, Jesus was standing on the beach, but they did not know it was Jesus. My sons, Jesus said, you haven't caught any fish, have you? No. Throw your nets on the starboard side of the boat. I'm guessing it means the other side. Starboard is the right-hand side of the boat. And your net will find the fish. They did what he said, and suddenly they could not lift their net because of the massive weight of the fish that filled it. The disciple loved by Jesus turned to Peter and said, it is the Lord. And by the way, who's the disciple that was beloved?
John.
All right, who is the disciple that gave himself that title? John. Okay? And if you read through the book, this is extra, okay? I'm not giving a charge for this additional information. But John and Peter seem to have this rivalry. So like even leading up to this, when there were 2 disciples that went to the trial of Jesus. All right, after like the Garden of Gethsemane incident, 2 disciples were running there, and John recounts that Peter was running, but the disciple Jesus loved got there first. Okay? He wanted that written down for the history books, right? And so over and over again, he's like, yeah, but the one that Jesus loved, and we'll see that kind of play out again. And so that's a little bit additional information. It doesn't necessarily pertain to today, but he says the disciple that Jesus loved was the first to identify Jesus on the shore. Wow, right? Big surprise from the gospel writer who authored this book. Immediately, when Simon Peter heard these words, he threw on his shirt, which he would take off while he was working, dove into the sea, and the rest of the disciples followed him, bringing in the boat and dragging their net full of fish. They were close to the shore, fishing only about 100 yards out, And when they arrived on the shore, they saw a charcoal fire laid with fish on the grill. And it says Jesus had bread too. That's an important piece of information, right? File that away. Then Jesus says in verse 10, "Bring some of the fish you just caught." Simon Peter went back to the boat and unloaded the fish from the net. He pulled out 153 large fish from the net. Despite the number of fish, the net held without a tear. Jesus said, "Come and join me for breakfast." And not one of the disciples dared to ask, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus took the bread and gave it to each of them, and then he did the same with the fish. This was the third time the disciples had seen Jesus since his death and resurrection. They finished eating breakfast, and then Jesus turns to Simon, son of John, and says, "Do you love me more than these other things?" Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus says, "Take care of my lambs."
Amen.
Jesus asked him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Simon Peter responded, "Yes, Lord, you must surely know that I love you." Jesus said, "Shepherd my sheep." And for the third time, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter was hurt because he asked him the same question a third time. "Do you love me?" "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus responded, "Look after my sheep. I tell you the truth, when you were younger, you would pick up and go wherever you please, but when you grow old, someone else will help you and will take you places you do not want to go." Jesus said all of this as an indicator of the nature of Peter's death, which would glorify God. And after this conversation, Jesus said, "Follow me."
Amen.
All right. Did you guys hear the mystery? What does not make sense about that passage? There might be a couple things too. All right. Okay. A fish, good. What else? Yeah, why he has to get dressed and then jump in the water, he could have taken a boat trip back, right? I like that. What else didn't make sense?
Why you had to ask 3 times?
Why he had to ask 3 times? Perfect, perfect. What else?
He threw the net the wrong side when we did it go.
A port side? Okay. I don't know if that's true, but maybe it very well could be. I'm not a fisherman. Others? Love and feeding sheep. You know what I always find interesting? Guys, you know what 2 weeks ago Sunday was?
Easter.
Easter Sunday, right? Easter is resurrection. Jesus was crucified, he was buried, and he was raised. He came to life. All right? This should be like a massive block party. Everybody's dancing in the street. Like this is great news. And yet Jesus is talking about death. Okay? And we're all, like, what? Wait, what? What? Why are we talking about death? We should be talking about resurrection right now. Amen? Right? And yet we're not talking about the resurrection. Now, here's a few years back. It was really 1999. It was, this big scare. They had this scare because all the computers had been coded with 2 numbers instead of 4 for the year. And so they thought every computer system on the planet was going to crash, and they called it the Y2K. And so at the stroke of midnight, everything was going to go black, and people were predicting the end of the world and all this. And I'm like, well, this is awesome sauce, right? I want to see this go down. And I happened to be in Italy at the time. I was in Rome. I was living in Rome for a month. And I was going to be on the front row, I felt, with like some big stuff going down, right? And when I was cruising around, I would go through these open-air markets, and they would have the coolest stuff in there. And they didn't have to, like, it wasn't like vintage was that precious in their eyes, because they were living in this world where it's just like, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years old. And they've got all this great architecture and art. And so these markets, they would have these ancient little treasures that you would see, and some of them were really expensive, and some were probably more in the student, finances range. And so I found, as like a memento, I found something that I could afford, and it was a rosary. All right, it's made of wood, wooden beads, And it's got kind of like this cracked cross. It's inlaid like some kind of ebony wood, and there's an actual Christ figure on there. And it was like, it looked old. Of course, I didn't speak Italian enough to figure out any of the history, but I thought this is a really cool piece. I want to keep this as kind of a memento of my time there. You know what's weird is, there's a couple things that's weird. Maybe you guys don't know this, but a lot of Protestant churches, we have a cross like this one here on the stage, but we don't have Christ on there, right? We don't have Christ on there, and there's a theological reason for that, right? And then the Catholics will generally put a cross, not Christ on the cross. And what they do is they're putting it there to signify the suffering of Christ. And so as they pray and as they look at this, they realize life is filled with pain, life is filled with hardship. I am suffering and going through suffering, or I will suffer, but it's okay because Christ suffered as well, right? And they'll wear these all the time. They carry them around and they use them to pray. And so the cross is like a very common image. Not just in Christian circles, but it's like the number one tattoo people will get on their body is a cross, right? And even, nudged out, I heart mom, right? Like this is a big deal. The cross is this image that's inescapable from society. It's everywhere, and it's got this symbolism and this rich meaning behind it that somehow has made it part of not just our culture, but cultures across the globe. I remember reading a book called My Name is Asher Lev about, it's a fictional story of a young man who was the son of a rabbi, and he was supposed to take over after his father retired, and yet he was an artist. And his passion and his skill set was to paint. And so he was painting and painting. And all this time, he quietly watched the suffering of his mother, who spent all of her time in the kitchen and working and all these things. And he kept trying to find a way to visualize the pain that she was experiencing, the suffering she was experiencing. And eventually what he did is he drew, this young Jewish man, drew a picture of his mom on a cross, right? Which was blasphemous, was hard for the Jewish community to witness. But it was such a fitting emblem or symbol. Guys, this cross image does not make sense. It does not make sense because if you were killed using a cross in ancient times, that was an insult. This cross was meant to shame those who died. It was an emblem of suffering and shame, and yet Christians continually put the cross in their artwork. They continue to wear the cross. They continue to exalt the cross. Why would we do that? And why would the cross still be here today? Why are we not wearing little empty tombs on prayer beads like this? Right? Wouldn't that make sense? We're all about the resurrection, and yet the cross still prevails. Why? It doesn't make sense, right? Until you start to understand what the cross's meaning and significance truly is, all right? So this is what I want to talk to you about this morning. Just for a few minutes, I want to talk about what the cross is and why it's still important to today, even post-resurrection, even post-Easter. There's a lot of people who wonder about this death and resurrection of Christ. And yet, as excited as we can get about the resurrection, we continue to read, like I said, come face to face with the cross, what it means. And as you start to replay in your mind, just think about where the Bible was written after the cross, or these Gospels, right? The New Testament Gospels were written after the cross and after the resurrection, and yet the primary focus of all the Gospel writers is not on the resurrection. It's almost always on the cross. Think about John 3:16, one of our favorite verses, right? For God so loved the world that He gave His only Son. It's not that His Son was raised. It's talking about the death, the crucifixion of Christ, not the resurrection of Christ. And so Jesus, when He bids His followers to come after Him, what does He say? Take up your cross and follow me. Right? And so there's something about this cross that we're supposed to get today. And really the cross, if we look at it, it has a lot of roots, and I'm not going to be able to unpack everything today. But even this passage that we just read is rich with imagery of sacrifice, of the cross, of the crucifixion. And so there's a couple things I want to just point out. The cross, sometimes we think that's just Christ paying for our sins, now we're free. And I'm not sure that's that's maybe too simplistic of an answer. I think the cross is something that calls us to not only live a new life, but to die to our old life. Right?
Amen.
It means that there's sacrifice involved. So if it weren't for the cross, I tell you what you would want to do with your life. If it weren't for the cross, here's what you should live your life for. You should live your life to make a lot of money. Right? Because life is short. And I tell you what, you're going to be rolling around in nice cars, you're going to have great clothes, and you're going to have, like all the stuff. And it's going to feel like a really great life until what? You run out of money. Sure. Or you realize at some point it's not buying you happiness. Right? You would live and give in your life for money, and yet money didn't bring you joy. In fact, what it did is it made you afraid that you were going to lose your money. You became very protective around it. You continue to find yourself doing deals where you unintentionally or either intentionally or unintentionally oppress other people. And then at the end of your life, you can't take any of it with you. You cash out, but your money stays there. Right? And so it seems like a hard reality, right? You say, okay, well, maybe I want to have power, right? I'm going to live my life to be a powerful person, to rise up the ranks, climb the ladder, and I want to be the top rung of the ladder. But the problem with living your life for power? What happens when you get to the top of the ladder?
Lonely.
You're going to retire at some point, and you're the CEO and president, and now you become an old man or an old woman who putters around in their garden, okay? And you think, what the heck did I just live my entire life to accomplish? Because everything I built over decades is gone in one day. Literally, I stepped out of the office one day as the president and CEO of this, whatever it is, multinational corporation, and now I am nobody. In hardly any time at all, no one will remember my name. And so power doesn't seem like a worthy pursuit in life. And so some of you say, I want to live for love. I want to live for sex. I want to live for this romance, right, that I see in the movies. And yet, it doesn't last, right? Everything we go through, it could be this romance, this love, that's all temporal. One day, you're going to die, or your spouse is going to die. Your significant other is going to die. And maybe you're going to be there, and you're going to watch them, you're going to hold their hand, and it's going to be sad. But you're going to realize, maybe that was not worthwhile to spend my life pursuing. Or maybe you want to be the cool kid, right? You want to look good. You want to have all the cunning remarks. And the reality is, look at me, man. I might have been good looking way back. I don't know, right? It's fleeting. Thank you. I paid him. He's a plant. Right? And so all this stuff is stuff that we're going to ultimately lose. And yet we hold on to it so tightly. And the cross says, you're not living your reason why, your full potential. Because way back at the beginning, there was a story of creation in which God said, let us make man in our image. Right?
Yeah.
That's Genesis 1, 25 and 26. And he made Adam and Eve in his image, and he told them to be fruitful and multiply, and that they'd have dominion over the planet. And what their job was, what their function, what they were built to do, is they were made to be image bearers. They were to reflect the image of the divine. And this set them above and higher than the rest of creation because they alone were image bearers. They were made in the likeness of God. And yet, by chapter 3, Adam and Eve came to a crossroads where they had this beautiful, shiny object placed in front of them that they could get more glory for themselves. They could get more honor for themselves. And they could trade their reflection of God's image for making the world into their image. And they made that trade. So they put themselves first rather than God first. They put their needs first, or their wants first, ahead of God's design and purpose for them. And when they did that, so God had just made them in His image. When they did that, they literally started to unmake themselves. Their very cause and reason for existence was to do this one thing. So imagine if your toaster, you plugged it in, you put toast in, and it would not go down. You could press the button, but it would not go down. Or maybe it would go down, but the heating element does not work any longer. What do you do with a toaster like that?
Throw it out.
You throw it away, right? Because it's no longer serving its function. It's no longer performing the job for which it's no longer, its worth and value has been compromised. And that's essentially what Adam and Eve did. They exchanged the glory of reflecting the infinite God for the possibility of having their own glory in and of themselves. And in doing so, they lost so much. And so they traded all this just so that they could be number one, that they could have power, they could have the world in their image. And yet, that decision cost not only them, but all of humanity a lot, even their own sons. Remember Cain and Abel? You have Cain, who was a farmer growing produce, and Abel, who was a shepherd. And God had said to them, I want you to make a sacrifice from here on, right? That you will sacrifice an animal, a lamb. And you will remember the sacrifice, right? The sacrifice, that your decisions have a cost associated with them. That you will continue to die to yourself. That these decisions are what have brought this on. And yet, Cain doesn't like that. He doesn't want to kill an animal, and who does, right? Nobody's like, yay, I get to kill an animal. That sounds great. And so he brings some produce to his altar because he's a farmer. But he undoes. He puts his needs and his wants in front of God's needs and wants. In fact, when God calls him out, he was willing to destroy his own brother, who was a reminder that he was doing wrong. Right? And so when we go back, and I don't want to go into this too far, I know this can go on and on, but when we look at this story, the first thing we have to understand is Peter was a fisherman. All right, I'll give you just a couple quick examples from this story, particularly John 21, and then we'll close it up. Hang with me. So, first of all, Peter was a fisherman. He had followed Jesus for years, faithfully. Jesus had died, he'd been resurrected, and Peter had lost sight of the mission, right? And so what does he do? He goes back to his what he knew. Peter was a fisherman, so he says, I'm not going to just sit around here. I'm going to go back to my old profession. I'm going to start fishing. Makes sense, right? And yet that profession was closed to him. He fished all night and he caught nothing. He caught nothing. And then Jesus shows up and says, throw your nets on the other side of the boat. And suddenly they pull in more fish than they can possibly carry. That they cannot, they have to literally just row into shore. And why Peter, I think, jumps in is because this is reminiscent of Peter's first call. Because in Luke chapter 5, Peter is there when Jesus comes down to the Sea of Galilee. And he is there when Peter steps into his boat and teaches the multitude. And Peter is the one who rows Jesus out into the depths after a night without any fish. And Peter's the one, after he's cleaned and folded his nets, that throws his nets back in the water because Jesus tells him to do so. And Peter's the one that starts to pull up those nets. And there's so many fish that two boats start to sink trying to just pull them into shore. And at that moment, Peter says that's the beginning of his call to faith and his walk, his journey of faith. And so this is a reminder to Peter of his initial call to ministry, right? So he could not go back to his old profession. God had called him to tend his sheep, not his fish. Right? And so that old profession, that old self had to die. We already talked about this imagery of sheep rather than fish. The interesting thing, sheep, it's an image of worship, isn't it? The reason, the sacrifice and of worship, the sacrifice that Peter should have been willing to make Now, this is not in Scripture, but I think it's interesting. There's a play, a musical called Jesus Christ Superstar, right? Way back. Some of you know it, some of you maybe heard of it, and I'm not going to get into the specifics, but at this interchange, Peter has denied his Lord 3 times, so I think it's interesting that Jesus calls him back 3 times. I think there's an interesting counterpart there. But in Jesus Christ Superstar, I think it was Mary Magdalene came to Peter after the denial and said, what did you do? Why did you do it? He said, don't you understand? If I had owned that I was with Jesus, they would have killed me too. They would have killed me too. I would have been sacrificed. And that's exactly what Jesus calls all of us to. Is to come. He bids us to take up our cross and follow him. He says, come and die. Right?
That's right.
Die to yourself, to your desires, to your wants, to your wishes. And so here is another image of sacrifice. But it's in this sacrifice there is worship that refocuses our lives and our meaning and our purpose back on Christ and on the God that created us in his image. Does it make sense?
That's right.
The last thing that he uses, which is interesting, and there's more here, is when Jesus is feeding them breakfast, all the imagery in this passage feels exactly like the Last Supper. Down into the bread, where Jesus took the bread and he broke it. He said, take and eat this bread. This bread is a symbol of my body, which was broken for you.
That's right.
Eat this in remembrance of me. Right? And so here they come and he separates out the fish and he breaks that bread and he passes it out to them, reminding them, I have led the way. I was the one who jumped off the high dive first so that you would be courageous enough that you could follow after me and you could jump off the high dive.
Come on, man.
You could make the same sacrifice I made. Because you can still live for the same priorities that you were initially called to live for. And I promise you, it may not bring you health, it may not bring you wealth, it may not bring you all the earthly joys that can be experienced, but it will give you a satisfaction like no other because it will be in line with your design.
Amen.
Does that make sense?
Amen.
And so guys, even as we're a couple weeks out from Easter and resurrection, I just want to once again remind you of Christ's call to you as your plan in your life to come and die, to take up your cross daily and follow him.
Amen. Amen.